Before we begin tonight's investigation, I want to ask for your support. If you find value in this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you could possibly know. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review makes an enormous difference in reaching new listeners, and if you feel like it, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're tuning in from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is listening. Finally, if you enjoy this kind of deep dive documentary content, please consider subscribing. It means everything. Tonight's story comes from a suggestion by Ms. Shi, and I knew immediately it needed to be told. Thank you for bringing this to my attention. The file sat in a banker's box in a government archive for nearly 40 years before anyone outside a classified circle ever saw it. When it was finally declassified, the language inside was clinical, procedural, almost boring. But buried in that bureaucratic prose was something far more disturbing than any sensational headline could convey. It was a record of bones, thousands of them, taken from the dead without permission, catalogued by age, location and radioactive content. Most belonged to children. The project had a name that sounded almost cheerful, Project Sunshine, but there was nothing bright about what it revealed. This is not a story about monsters or conspiracies in the traditional sense. This is a story about what happens when scientific necessity collides with human dignity, about decisions made in silence, about data collected in the dark, and about a question that still echoes today. What is acceptable in the name of protecting the public, especially when the public never knows it's happening? Welcome to the story of Project Sunshine. Chapter 1. A world changed by the atom. The atomic age did not arrive quietly. It came with a flash of light over the deserts of New Mexico in the summer of 1945. It came with the obliteration of 2 cities in Japan. It came with promises of a future powered by the atom and threats of annihilation that could arrive in minutes. By the early 1950s, the world had entered a new kind of arms race. The United States and the Soviet Union were detonating nuclear weapons in the atmosphere with alarming regularity. Tests were conducted in Nevada, the Pacific, the Arctic, and Kazakhstan. Mushroom clouds rose over atolls and deserts. Shock waves rippled across continents. The public was told these tests were controlled, distant, safe. There is no danger to civilians, officials assured again and again. But behind closed doors, concern was mounting, because while the explosions were visible and the shockwaves measurable, something else was spreading, something invisible, something that didn't respect borders or oceans or assurances. Fallout. Radioactive particles were drifting through the atmosphere, settling into soil, water and food supplies. They were entering the food chain, and from there they were entering human bodies. The first signs appeared in livestock. Ranchers in Nevada reported unusual deaths among cattle, grazing downwind from test sites. Veterinarians found lesions and burns that had no obvious cause. Milk samples from dairy farms began showing elevated radiation readings. Scientists began to ask uncomfortable questions. How much radiation were people actually absorbing? Was it accumulating over time? Were certain populations more vulnerable than others? And most troubling of all, were children at greater risk? These were not abstract questions. They were urgent, and they required data. Real data. Human data. The problem was that radiation exposure was difficult to measure in living subjects. External monitoring could detect surface contamination, but internal exposure, particularly the accumulation of radioactive isotopes in bones and organs, required invasive procedures or post-mortem examination. That need would give birth to one of the most ethically troubling research programs in modern history. The Atomic Energy Commission faced a dilemma. Public confidence in the nuclear testing program was essential. The arms race demanded continued development and testing of ever more powerful weapons. Any admission that fallout posed a genuine threat to civilian populations could undermine support for the entire enterprise. Yet the scientific uncertainty was real. Without reliable data about how radioactive materials move through the human body, policymakers were operating blind. They needed answers. but they needed those answers quietly. In conference rooms across Washington, scientists and government officials began discussing options. Animal studies were ongoing, but their applicability to humans remained questionable. Volunteer studies were proposed but deemed impractical. Who would willingly expose themselves to radiation for research purposes? And how? Could such a study be conducted without revealing the extent of public concern about fallout? The solution they arrived at was both ingenious and morally bankrupt. They would study the dead. Chapter 2. The Creation of Project Sunshine. In 1953, a group of scientists and government officials convened to address a growing problem. Atmospheric nuclear testing was continuing at an aggressive pace, but public anxiety was beginning to rise. Reports of contaminated milk, radioactive rain, and mysterious illnesses were starting to circulate. The Atomic Energy Commission needed answers, not speculation, not theory, facts. They needed to know exactly how much radioactive material was entering human bodies and where it was going once it got there. Project Sunshine was born from this urgency. Officially, it was described as a research initiative to study the distribution of radioactive isotopes in human tissue. The goal was to measure strontium-90, a byproduct of nuclear fission that mimicked calcium in the body. It accumulated in bones. It stayed there. And it was especially dangerous to growing children, whose bodies were rapidly building skeletal structure. If strontium-90 was embedding itself in bones, scientists needed to know how much, how fast, and in whom. The project was international in scope. Researchers coordinated with institutions in the United Kingdom, Australia, South Africa, and other allied nations. The language used in internal memos was careful, professional, detached. Initial planning documents outlined a comprehensive sampling strategy. Tissue would be collected from multiple age groups, but particular emphasis would be placed on infants and young children. Their rapidly developing bones would show the clearest evidence of strontium accumulation. Geographic diversity was essential to compare fallout levels across regions affected by different test sites and weather patterns. Funding was allocated through existing research, budgets carefully dispersed to avoid drawing attention. Laboratory facilities were identified at major research universities and government installations. Protocols were developed for sample collection, preservation, and analysis. But there was a problem. Animal studies could only tell them so much. Rats and monkeys did not metabolize strontium the same way humans did. The data they provided was useful, but incomplete. What they needed were human bones, fresh ones. And that is where the ethical foundation of Project Sunshine began to crack. The scientists involved were not villains in the traditional sense. They were researchers who genuinely believed in the importance of their work. Many had witnessed the devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They understood the stakes of the nuclear age in visceral terms. They saw their research as a necessary step toward understanding and potentially mitigating the long-term consequences of atmospheric testing. But somewhere in the planning process, a crucial question was never adequately addressed. Did the importance of the research justify the methods required to conduct it? The answer they arrived at was yes, but they never asked the families. Chapter 3. The Unspoken Requirement. The decision was never announced publicly. There was no press release, no congressional hearing, no informed consent process. Instead, there was a quiet understanding among those involved. Human tissue samples would be collected. They would come from the recently deceased, and families would not be told. The reasoning, as later documents would reveal, was framed as practical. Asking permission would raise questions. Questions would lead to fear. Fear would lead to public panic. Panic would undermine the testing program and damage national security. Better, the thinking went, to proceed quietly. After all, the individuals were already dead. The tissue would otherwise be buried or cremated. Why not put it to scientific use? This logic, cold, utilitarian, and entirely one-sided, became the ethical cornerstone of the project. No one asked the families. No one explained what was happening. No one sought consent. The decision had been made at the highest levels. The work would proceed. Internal memos from the period reveal the careful linguistic gymnastics employed to avoid confronting the ethical implications directly. One document refers to obtaining samples through established pathological channels. Another describes the process as routine tissue acquisition for research purposes. The word consent appears nowhere in the early planning documents. There were dissenters. Some pathologists and medical examiners expressed reservations about participating in a program that operated without family knowledge. A few refused outright, but they were in the minority. Most were assured that the research was vital to national security and public health. Many were simply ordered to comply. The institutional machinery that enabled Project Sunshine was already in place. Hospitals and morgues routinely conducted autopsies. Tissue samples were frequently retained for medical education and research purposes. Extending these practices to include samples for radiation research required only minor procedural modifications, and so the infrastructure was established. Pathologists were contacted, protocols were distributed, sample collection began, and so it did. Chapter 4. The silent collection hospitals became collection sites. Morgues became supply chains. Medical examiners became unwitting participants in a global research network. The process was methodical. When a body arrived, particularly the body of an infant or young child, tissue samples were quietly extracted. Bone fragments in particular were prioritized. Femurs, ribs, vertebrae. These were sectioned, labelled, and shipped to laboratories for analysis. The families were never informed. Death certificates made no mention of tissue removal. Funeral directors received bodies that had been sampled, but they had no way of knowing. In some cases, entire limbs were removed and replaced with wooden dowels or broomsticks to maintain the appearance of an intact body for viewing. This practice, while shocking in retrospect, was not unprecedented. Similar substitutions had been used in anatomical procurement for medical schools for decades, but the context made it deeply disturbing. Parents grieving the loss of a child had no idea that the small body they held at a funeral was not entirely as they believed. The violation was invisible, complete, and irreversible. This was not illegal, strictly speaking. There were few regulations governing the use of cadaveric tissue in the early 1950s. Autopsy laws varied by state and country, but most granted broad discretion to medical examiners and pathologists. The legal framework that would later establish requirements for informed consent and next of kin notification did not yet exist. But legality and ethics are not synonymous, and what was happening under Project Sunshine violated a fundamental principle of human dignity, that people have a right to know what happens to their bodies and to the bodies of their loved ones. The collection process varied by location. In some hospitals, dedicated pathologists handled the sampling. In others, the work was distributed among rotating staff. Some institutions maintained detailed records of which bodies had been sampled. Others kept minimal documentation. Samples were assigned identification numbers that corresponded to basic demographic data: age, sex, date of death, and location. But names were removed to protect privacy. This had the effect of transforming individual human beings into anonymous data points. A 6-month-old infant from Chicago became sample 312. A 3-year-old from London became sample 498. The dehumanization was procedural, not malicious, but the effect was the same, and it was widespread. Samples were collected from New York, Chicago, London, Melbourne, Johannesburg, and dozens of other cities. The project sought geographic diversity to compare fallout levels across regions. Urban and rural populations, coastal and inland, northern and southern hemispheres. The world, in effect, became a laboratory, and the subjects had no idea they were part of the experiment. By 1955, Project Sunshine had collected samples from more than 1,500 bodies. By 1957, that number had grown to over 5,000. The scale was staggering. The secrecy was absolute. Chapter 5. A Global Network. By the mid-1950s, Project Sunshine had evolved into one of the most extensive tissue sampling operations in medical history. Researchers coordinated across continents. Samples were catalogued by age, sex, location, and date of death. Strontium-90 levels were measured with increasing precision. Patterns began to emerge. Children showed higher concentrations than adults. Populations near testing sites showed elevated readings. Fallout levels varied by season and weather patterns. The international dimension of the project revealed disparities that were both scientifically significant and politically uncomfortable. Samples from Australia, for instance, showed elevated strontium levels, corresponding to British nuclear tests conducted at Maralinga and Emu Field. Samples from regions downwind of the Nevada test site showed similar elevations. The data was startling. It confirmed what scientists had feared. Radioactive material was not staying in the stratosphere. It was coming down. It was entering the food supply, and it was accumulating in human tissue. This was not theoretical contamination. This was measurable, quantifiable, real. The findings were shared in classified reports. They informed policy decisions about testing frequency, atmospheric conditions, and public messaging. Atmospheric. Testing protocols were quietly adjusted. Certain test series were delayed or relocated. Meteorological data was incorporated into test planning to minimise fallout over populated areas. But the public was never told why, because to explain the adjustments would require explaining the data, and to explain the data would require explaining how it was obtained. The coordination required for Project Sunshine was remarkable in its scope. Tissue samples had to be preserved properly during collection, packaged for international shipping, and delivered to analysis facilities without degradation. Specialised laboratories capable of measuring trace levels of radioactive isotopes had to be identified and secured. Results had to be compiled, cross-referenced, and interpreted. All of this required extensive bureaucratic infrastructure, purchase orders, shipping manifests, laboratory reports, personnel clearances, and all of it had to remain secret. The paper trail existed, but it was buried in classified files dispersed across multiple agencies and institutions. Individual researchers often knew only their specific role in the larger operation. Pathologists collecting samples might not know where the tissue was being sent or what would be done with it. Laboratory technicians analysing samples might not know their origin. This compartmentalisation was deliberate. It minimised the risk of leaks and reduced the likelihood that any single individual would grasp the full scope of the operation. Project Sunshine remained classified, but the data it generated was beginning to have an impact. Chapter 6. What the data revealed. The results were published in obscure scientific journals under titles that gave no hint of their origin. Papers with names like strontium metabolism in human bone or radioisotope distribution in pediatric skeletal tissue appeared in radiological and biochemical publications. The language was dense, technical, deliberately inaccessible to lay readers, but the conclusions were clear. Strontium-90 was present in every sample tested. Children born after 1945 showed higher levels than those born before. Levels peaked in populations geographically closer to test sites or downwind from atmospheric detonations. The half-life of strontium-90 meant it would remain in bones for decades. This was evidence of a global contamination event, and it was happening in real time. The scientific implications were profound. Strontium-90, once absorbed into bone tissue, could irradiate surrounding cells for years. In children whose bones were still growing and whose cells were dividing rapidly, this posed a particular risk. The potential for long-term health effects, including increased cancer rates and developmental abnormalities, was undeniable. The data also revealed something unexpected: the variability of exposure. Not all populations showed the same levels of contamination. Diet played a significant role. Communities that relied heavily on dairy products showed higher strontium levels because cows concentrated the isotope in their milk. Children who consumed more milk, which was recommended for healthy bone development, were paradoxically at higher risk. This created a cruel irony. The very dietary practices designed to promote child health were also serving as vectors for radioactive contamination. The findings influenced policy in quiet ways. The United States and the Soviet Union eventually moved toward underground testing. Atmospheric tests became less frequent. International agreements were drafted, though slowly. Scientists began advocating for reductions in testing, based on evidence they could not publicly disclose. By 1963, the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty was signed, prohibiting atmospheric, underwater and space-based nuclear tests. The treaty was hailed as a triumph of diplomacy and scientific rationality. It was presented as a mutual recognition of the dangers posed by continued atmospheric testing. What was not mentioned was the source of the evidence that made those dangers undeniable. Project Sunshine had provided the data that informed the treaty, but the cost of that evidence had been concealed. The scientific community celebrated the treaty as a victory. Atmospheric testing declined dramatically. Fallout levels began to decrease. Within a few years, strontium-90 levels in human tissue started to drop. The danger had been real. The response had been effective, but the methods used to gather the evidence remained hidden. Chapter 7. The Secrecy. For years, Project Sunshine existed in a state of deliberate obscurity. Scientists involved in the project were instructed not to discuss their work publicly. Research findings were shared within classified networks, but withheld from broader medical and scientific communities. Funding was funneled through agencies with innocuous names. Reports were written in language designed to obscure rather than illuminate. Even within the government, awareness of the project was limited. Congressional oversight was minimal. The public had no knowledge of it whatsoever. When questions did arise, they were deflected. Journalists who inquired about radiation research were given sanitized explanations. Government spokespeople emphasized ongoing efforts to monitor environmental contamination through soil and water sampling. They mentioned animal studies and atmospheric monitoring, but they never mentioned the human tissue collection program. Concerned citizens were reassured that all testing was safe and all research ethical. Letters to government agencies expressing worry about fallout received form responses emphasizing safety protocols and careful monitoring. The responses were technically truthful. Monitoring was indeed occurring, but they omitted the most disturbing details. Whistleblowers, if they existed, were silenced through classification restrictions and security clearances. Anyone with knowledge of the program had signed agreements prohibiting disclosure. Violation could result in prosecution under espionage laws. The threat was real and sufficient to ensure silence. The narrative was controlled, and the truth remained buried. The secrecy was maintained not just through legal mechanisms, but through institutional culture. Scientists working on classified programs understood that discretion was expected. Many had been involved in the Manhattan Project or other wartime research efforts. They were accustomed to working on projects whose full scope and purpose were known only to a select few. This culture of secrecy had served a purpose during the war, but it persisted long after, creating an environment where ethical oversight was minimal and public accountability non-existent. The compartmentalization that protected Project Sunshine from exposure also insulated it from scrutiny. Individual participants could rationalize their involvement by focusing on their limited role. Pathologists told themselves they were simply collecting samples as directed. Laboratory technicians focused on the technical aspects of their analysis. Administrators processed paperwork without questioning its purpose. No single person bore full responsibility, and therefore no one felt fully accountable. But secrets, especially ones involving thousands of families, do not stay hidden forever. The first hints of trouble came not from whistleblowers, but from journalists investigating unrelated radiation experiments. In the 1970s, reporters began uncovering stories about prisoners and hospital patients who had been subjected to radiation exposure without informed consent. These revelations prompted broader inquiries into government-sponsored research programs. Freedom of Information Act requests began yielding documents. Most were heavily redacted. But patient researchers, combing through thousands of pages, began to piece together fragments of a larger picture. References to tissue collection programs appeared in budget documents. Shipping manifests mentioned bone samples. Laboratory reports referenced strontium analysis. Slowly, The outline of Project Sunshine began to emerge. Chapter 8. The Truth Emerges. The first cracks in the secrecy appeared in the early 1980s. Journalists began uncovering documents related to Cold War radiation experiments. Freedom of Information Act requests yielded heavily redacted files. Researchers digging through archived government records stumbled onto references to tissue collection programs. Slowly, the scope of Project Sunshine came into focus. The initial reports were fragmented and incomplete. Individual journalists working independently had discovered pieces of the story, but none had assembled the complete picture. A reporter in Boston uncovered records of bone sample shipments from local hospitals. A researcher in London found references to a coordinated tissue collection effort involving multiple countries. An investigative journalist in Washington obtained budget documents showing funding for a project with the codename Sunshine. As these fragments came together, the implications became impossible to ignore. In 1994, a presidential advisory committee was formed to investigate human radiation experiments conducted during the Cold War. Project Sunshine was among the programs examined. The committee was granted access to classified files and authorized to interview former participants. What they found was damning. Thousands of tissue samples had been collected without consent. Families had been kept in the dark. Children's remains had been used as data points in a global monitoring system. The scale and duration of the program exceeded anything previously disclosed. The committee's final report, published in 1995, ran to more than 900 pages. An entire chapter was devoted to Project Sunshine. The language was measured but unequivocal in its criticism. The report concluded that while the scientific objectives of the project were legitimate, the methods employed were ethically indefensible. The failure to obtain consent violated fundamental principles of research ethics. The deception practiced on grieving families compounded the violation, and the secrecy maintained for decades prevented accountability and undermined public trust. Public reaction was muted but deeply unsettled. The story made headlines for a few days. Television news programs ran segments featuring interviews with elderly parents who learned, decades after the fact, that their children's bodies had been part of a research program. Their reactions ranged from anger to resignation to profound grief. Many expressed a sense of betrayal. They had trusted institutions, hospitals, government agencies, the medical profession, and that trust had been violated. The revelation reopened old wounds and created new bonds. Apologies were issued. The president made a formal statement expressing regret for the program and acknowledging the pain it had caused. Some compensation was offered to families who could be identified and located, though many could not. The passage of time had scattered families, destroyed records, and left gaps that could never be filled. But accountability was limited. Most of the individuals involved in the project had retired or died. Institutional responsibility was diffuse. The Atomic Energy Commission had been dissolved and reorganized. The hospitals and morgues that participated were scattered across multiple countries and jurisdictions. Legal liability was difficult to establish. The government acknowledged ethical failures, but the damage had been done decades earlier. Families who learned their loved ones had been part of the project expressed anger, grief, and betrayal. Many felt violated. Some sought legal recourse, though few cases succeeded. The statute of limitations had long since expired. Proving harm was difficult, and the legal framework for addressing historical injustices was limited. Support groups formed, bringing together families affected by Project Sunshine and similar programs. They shared stories, sought answers, and advocated for reforms to prevent future abuses. Some found a measure of closure in the acknowledgement of what had happened. Others felt the apologies were inadequate and the accountability insufficient. The story made headlines briefly, then faded. But it left a mark. The revelations about Project Sunshine contributed to a broader reckoning with the ethics of Cold War research. They prompted reforms in how research involving human subjects is conducted and overseen. They strengthened requirements for informed consent and institutional review. They established precedents for transparency and accountability. But they also revealed something troubling about how institutions behave when operating in secrecy. because the scientists and officials involved in Project Sunshine were not monsters. They were ordinary people working within a system that prioritised results over ethics, security over transparency, and expediency over accountability. And that system still exists. Chapter 9. The Conspiracy Interpretation. For conspiracy theorists, Project Sunshine is not a cautionary tale about scientific overreach. It is proof. Proof that governments are willing to treat their own citizens as expendable. Proof that secrecy is used not to protect the public, but to protect the powerful. Proof that consent is optional when the stakes are high enough. The theory goes like this. Project Sunshine was not just a monitoring program. It was part of a broader strategy to understand the effects of radiation exposure in preparation for nuclear conflict. Governments needed to know how populations would fare in a post-nuclear world. They needed baseline data on radiation absorption, accumulation, and biological impact, and they were willing to collect it by any means necessary. The tissue samples were not taken to protect children from fallout. They were taken to measure the damage that had already been done. And more than that, some theorists argue the data was used to calibrate expectations for a nuclear war. If policymakers knew how much radiation the population could absorb before experiencing catastrophic health effects, they could factor that into strategic planning. The acceptable casualty rates in a nuclear exchange could be calculated with greater precision. In this interpretation, atmospheric testing was not a regrettable necessity of weapons development. It was a deliberate experiment on a global scale. Civilians were not bystanders, they were test subjects. The fallout was not an unfortunate byproduct, but a field trial of radioactive contamination effects on real populations. And Project Sunshine was the autopsy report. This version of the story reframes the entire Cold War nuclear program as a series of calculated risks taken with other people's lives. It casts scientists not as heroes seeking to understand and mitigate danger, but as collaborators in a vast and morally corrosive system that prioritised strategic advantage over human welfare. It is a dark interpretation, but it is not entirely without evidence. Declassified documents reveal that military planners did indeed use data about radiation exposure to model the effects of nuclear war. They calculated acceptable casualty rates. They estimated how much contamination populations could endure. They factored these projections into targeting decisions and civil defence planning. The question is whether Project Sunshine was intended to serve these purposes from the beginning, or whether its data was simply repurposed for strategic planning after the fact. The official narrative holds that the project was purely scientific, an effort to understand the environmental and health consequences of atmospheric testing. The data it generated subsequently informed policy decisions, including decisions about nuclear strategy, but that was a secondary application. The conspiracy interpretation argues that the strategic applications were always the primary objective. The scientific justification was a cover story. The real purpose was to gather data that would be useful in planning for and surviving a nuclear war. The truth, as often happens, likely falls somewhere in between. Project Sunshine was probably conceived with genuine scientific objectives, but once the data existed, it was inevitable that it would be used for strategic purposes. And the people making decisions about the program were certainly aware of those potential applications. Whether that constitutes a conspiracy depends on how you define the term. If a conspiracy requires deliberate intent to deceive for malicious purposes, then Project Sunshine may not qualify. The deception was real, but the purpose was framed by those involved as protective rather than malicious. If a conspiracy simply requires secret coordination to achieve outcomes that would be unacceptable if publicly known, then Project Sunshine fits the definition perfectly. The semantic debate matters less than the underlying reality. A government program collected tissue from thousands of dead children without permission, kept the practice secret for decades, and used the resulting data to inform decisions about nuclear weapons and warfare. That is not theory. That is documented fact. Chapter 10. The Ethical Line. At the heart of Project Sunshine is a question that extends far beyond radiation or the Cold War. How far can a government go in the name of protecting its people? Is deception acceptable if it prevents panic? Is consent optional if the stakes are existential? Can the ends ever truly justify the means? Project Sunshine operated on the assumption that they could. The scientists involved believed they were doing necessary work. They were gathering data that could inform policy, save lives, and prevent catastrophic misjudgments about radiation exposure. In their view, the public good outweighed individual rights. The information they gathered contributed to decisions that eventually reduced atmospheric testing and lowered radiation exposure for millions of people. From a utilitarian perspective, the calculus might seem defensible. If the data from Project Sunshine helped end atmospheric testing, and if ending atmospheric testing prevented countless cases of cancer and genetic damage, then the violation of a few thousand families' rights might appear justified. But that calculus was made without asking the people most affected. The families who buried children never knew those children contributed to a global research project. The parents who grieved had no idea their loss was also a data point, and that absence of consent fundamentally undermines any utilitarian justification, because utilitarian ethics, properly applied, requires considering the interests and autonomy of all affected parties. By excluding families from the decision-making process, Project Sunshine violated the very principle it claimed to uphold, the greatest good for the greatest number. The families affected were not a small minority whose interests could be justifiably overridden for the greater good. They were thousands of people whose fundamental rights were violated, and their violation was not necessary for the research to succeed. An alternative approach was possible. Tissue collection programs based on informed consent have existed for decades. Many families, when asked, willingly donate tissue from deceased loved ones for medical research. Some might have declined, certainly, but many would have agreed if the purpose and importance of the research had been explained. The decision to proceed without consent was not based on impossibility. It was based on convenience and fear that asking for consent would raise uncomfortable questions, fear that transparency would undermine public support for nuclear testing, fear that honesty would expose the extent of radiation contamination. These fears may have been justified, but they do not justify the deception. The ethical line was crossed not in a moment of crisis, but in a series of quiet decisions made behind closed doors. Each decision seemed small, each could be rationalized, each moved the line a little further, and that perhaps is the most unsettling part, because it suggests the line is not fixed. It can be moved, and once it is moved, it becomes easier to move again. The history of human subjects research is littered with examples of this pattern. The Tuskegee syphilis study, the plutonium injection experiments, the involuntary sterilization programs. Each began with a rationale that seemed compelling to those involved. Each involved vulnerable populations. Each was conducted in secrecy or with inadequate oversight, and each violated fundamental ethical principles. Project Sunshine fits this pattern. It is not unique, it is emblematic, and the systems that enabled it have not been entirely dismantled. Modern research ethics regulations are stronger than they were in the 1950s. Institutional review boards provide oversight. Informed consent requirements are rigorously enforced. Transparency is expected, but exceptions still exist. Research conducted for national security purposes can be exempted from normal oversight. Emergency circumstances can justify deviations from consent requirements, and secrecy, when deemed necessary, can shield questionable practices from public scrutiny. The architecture that enabled Project Sunshine remains in place. It is better regulated, more constrained, subject to more oversight, but it exists, and that should concern us. Epilogue: The Invisible Legacy. Atmospheric nuclear testing ended decades ago. The mushroom clouds are gone, the fallout has settled, but the legacy remains. Strontium-90 is still present in the environment. It has a half-life of nearly 29 years, meaning traces of it persist in soil, water, and bones to this day. Every person alive who was born before the Test Ban Treaty carries some level of radioactive material in their body. The levels are low now, declining with each year that passes, but they are measurable. Project Sunshine is officially over. The files are declassified. The samples, for the most part, have been destroyed or returned. But the questions it raised have not been answered. What is the cost of knowledge? Who gets to decide what is acceptable in the name of science? And when does protection become exploitation? These are not historical questions. They are present ones. The COVID pandemic revealed similar tensions. Public health officials faced difficult decisions about lockdowns, vaccine mandates, and contact tracing. They balanced individual liberty against collective safety. They weighed transparency against preventing panic. They made choices that affected millions of lives based on incomplete information and urgent timelines. Some of those decisions were made with broad public input and democratic accountability. Others were made behind closed doors by experts and officials operating under emergency authorities. The fundamental dynamic that enabled Project Sunshine, governments making decisions for people without their knowledge, still exists. It exists in surveillance programs, in data collection, in public health policy, in emergency response. The tools have changed, the justifications have evolved, but the pattern remains. Modern technology has made surveillance and data collection easier and more pervasive than ever before. Governments and corporations gather vast amounts of information about individuals, often without explicit consent or awareness. The data is used for purposes ranging from targeted advertising to national security. The justifications are similar to those offered for Project Sunshine: efficiency, protection, the greater good. And the secrecy is often similar as well. People do not know what data is being collected about them. They do not know how it is being used. They do not know who has access to it or what decisions are being made based on it. The informed consent that is now required for medical research does not necessarily apply to data collection in other contexts. And that is the real conspiracy. Not that Project Sunshine happened, but that the conditions that made it possible still exist. The specific practices have changed. We are not collecting bone samples from dead children anymore, but we are collecting vast amounts of data from living people. We are making decisions that affect their lives, their health, and their freedom, and we are often doing so without their knowledge or meaningful consent. The justifications are always compelling: national security, public health, economic, efficiency, crime prevention, and the oversight is always inadequate, because the people making the decisions are not the people affected by them, and the people affected often do not know the decisions are being made. That was true in the 1950s. It is still true today. Project Sunshine stands as a reminder of what can happen when institutional power operates without accountability, when secrecy replaces transparency, when the ends are allowed to justify the means without asking whether the means themselves violate the principles the ends are meant to protect. The scientists involved in Project Sunshine were not evil. They were people doing what they believed was necessary work under extraordinary circumstances. Many probably struggled with the ethical dimensions of what they were doing. Some may have protested internally, even if they complied outwardly. But the system they were part of did not require them to be evil. It only required them to be compliant, to follow procedures, to trust that someone above them had made the right decision, to focus on their specific task without questioning the larger purpose. That is how institutional wrongdoing happens, not through individual malice, but through collective compliance. And that is why the legacy of Project Sunshine matters, because the most dangerous experiments are the ones people never knew they were part of, until it is far too late. The bones collected in the 1950s are gone now, returned to families when possible, destroyed or lost in many cases. The radioactive isotopes they contained have decayed. The scientific questions they were meant to answer have been answered, but the ethical questions remain. And they are questions we will have to answer again, in different contexts, with different technologies, for different reasons. But the fundamental dilemma is the same. How much can we trust institutions to act in our interest when we are not watching? How much power should we grant to those who claim to protect us? And what happens when protection becomes indistinguishable from exploitation? Project Sunshine does not provide answers to these questions, but it demonstrates, with painful clarity, what happens when they are not asked. Hey everyone, before we dive into tonight's story, if you're enjoying the content here on Sleep Theories, please consider using those hype points on this video. It genuinely helps the channel grow more than you could possibly know, and it allows us to keep bringing you these deep dives into the unexplained. Also, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from, but only if you want to, of course. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. It really builds this incredible community of curious minds from every corner of the globe. Also, a massive thank you to Dogface680 for suggesting this topic. Now, let's get into it. The Hynek Files. The scientist who saw too much. Imagine being the person the government calls when they need someone to make the impossible sound ordinary. Imagine spending 3 decades explaining away what you know, deep down, cannot be explained. Imagine carrying secrets so heavy that even on your deathbed you can only hint at the truth. This is the story of J. Allen Hynek, the astronomer who became the Air Force's chief UFO debunker, only to become the phenomenon's most credible believer. A man who spent 22 years inside Project Blue Book, the military's official UFO investigation program. A man who, by the end of his life, was convinced the government had been hiding the real story all along, and 3 months after giving his final interview, he was dead. The tapes from that interview, gone, vanished from a university archive by someone who never signed in. This is where documented truth becomes stranger than fiction. The last interview, April 1986, Evanston, Illinois. The room is small, cluttered with star charts and aging textbooks. Afternoon light filters through half-closed blinds, casting long shadows across the desk where J. Allen Hynek sits, 75 years old, his face lined with decades of secrets. Across from him, a graduate student adjusts a tape recorder. Her name is Rebecca Marks, though she won't become important to this story until much later. This is supposed to be a simple oral history project for Northwestern University, nothing more than an elderly professor reflecting on his career in astronomy. Standard academic documentation. But Hynek keeps glancing at the door. The student notices but doesn't comment. She's young, maybe 23, and she's done her research. She knows Hynek spent more than 2 decades as the scientific consultant to the Air Force's UFO investigation programs. She knows about Project Blue Book. She knows about the swamp gas explanation that made him a punchline in 1966. What she doesn't know yet is that this interview will haunt her for the rest of her life. They talk for 90 minutes. Hynek is measured, careful, professional. He discusses stellar classification, his work at Ohio State, the development of satellite tracking systems, all safe territory. His answers are the kind you'd expect from any distinguished astronomer nearing the end of his career. Thoughtful, precise, unremarkable. Rebecca notices his coffee cup. He's barely touched it. His hands rest on the desk, but his fingers keep tapping in a regular rhythm against the wood. Nervous energy from a man who spent his entire career projecting calm authority. Then, as she's packing up the recorder, reaching for the power button, Hynek speaks again. His voice is different now, quieter, urgent, almost a whisper. History will remember Project Blue Book as an investigation, he says, but it was really a filter. The real cases never reached the public. Rebecca's hand freezes over the recorder. She looks at him. What do you mean, the real cases? Hynek's hands are shaking slightly. He's staring at something beyond her, beyond the room, as if seeing through the walls into some distant memory he's carried for too long. The ones they told me not to classify as unexplained. The ones where the evidence was too clear, too consistent, too troubling. He pauses, and in that silence Rebecca can hear the buildings settle around them. The hum of fluorescent lights, the distant sound of traffic on Sheridan Road. There were files I could never see, Hynek continues. Reports removed before I arrived. Witnesses told to recant their statements. Photographs that disappeared before analysis. Who told them to recant? Hynek just shakes his head slowly. People who decided what the public could handle. People who understood that some truths destabilize entire systems of belief. Rebecca asks if she can keep recording. Hynek says no. but he keeps talking anyway for another 20 minutes, off the record. She frantically pulls out a notebook and scribbles, trying to capture every word. He mentions cases by location and date, incidents she's never heard of. A radar tracking event over Montana in 1953 involving multiple installations. Visual confirmations by commercial pilots over the Great Lakes in 1961. Objects tracked across state lines, moving at speeds that made no aerodynamic sense. Physical evidence, burned soil, electromagnetic interference, radiation signatures that disappeared into classified channels before civilian scientists could examine it. "Why didn't you say something publicly?" she asks, her pen moving rapidly across the page. "I tried," Hynek replies, and there's something broken in his voice now. "In my way, carefully. I spoke at universities. I wrote papers with coded language. I built networks with other researchers. But there are people who don't want this conversation to happen. Not because they're evil, necessarily. Because they're terrified of what it means." He leans forward, and Rebecca sees something in his eyes she'll remember for the rest of her life. Not fear, exactly. More like the exhaustion of a man who's carried a weight too heavy for too long. Do you know what happens when you tell the public that everything they believe about reality might be incomplete? When you suggest that non-human intelligence has been interacting with us, studying us, for decades? The social structures we've built, religion, science, government authority, they all rest on certain assumptions. You pull one thread. He doesn't finish the sentence. He doesn't have to. Before she leaves, he tells her one more thing. The real story is in the cases they never let me touch. 3 months later, J. Allen Hynek is dead. Heart attack. Nothing suspicious on paper. The obituaries call him a distinguished astronomer and the scientific advisor to Project Blue Book. They mention his later work founding the Center for UFO Studies. They're respectful, brief, forgettable. When Rebecca Marks returns to the university archive 2 weeks later to review the interview tape for her thesis, she's told it's missing. The archive log shows someone checked it out 6 days after Hynek's death. No name, no signature, no ID number, just a checkout date and time, May 3rd, 1986, 2:15 p.m. Rebecca files a complaint. The university apologises, calls it an administrative error. The tape is never found. She asks to see security footage from the archive reading room. She's told the system was malfunctioning that week. She contacts the campus police. They file a report and nothing happens. Years later, after she's completed her PhD and moved into a career in science journalism, Rebecca will occasionally Google J. Allen Hynek's name. She'll read the conspiracy forums, the UFO research sites, the academic papers analysing Project Blue Book's methodology. And she'll wonder if Hynek knew his time was running out. If that interview was his last attempt to leave breadcrumbs for someone willing to follow them. If he suspected someone was listening, watching, waiting for him to say too much. She still has her handwritten notes from those 20 minutes after the recording stopped. She keeps them in a safe deposit box. She's never published them. She's not sure she ever will. But sometimes, late at night, she takes them out and reads them again. And she thinks about what Hynek said. The real story is in the cases they never let me touch. The public history versus the secret history. To understand what Hynek knew and why it terrified him, you have to understand who he was before the Air Force recruited him. Joseph Allen Hynek was born May 1st, 1915 in Chicago, son of Czech immigrants who'd fled Europe seeking opportunity and stability. His father worked in a cigar factory. His mother took in sewing. They were working-class people who valued education above everything else. From childhood, Hynek was obsessed with the stars. He'd spend hours on the roof of their apartment building with a homemade telescope, charting constellations, tracking planets. His parents couldn't afford books, so he haunted the public library, devouring everything he could find about astronomy, physics, mathematics. He was brilliant. Everyone knew it. Teachers, neighbours, family friends. By age 12, he was doing university-level mathematics. By 15, he taught himself calculus. He earned a scholarship to the University of Chicago, then completed his doctorate in astrophysics by age 24. His dissertation on stellar spectroscopy, the analysis of starlight to determine a star's composition and characteristics, was considered groundbreaking work. By 1940, he'd secured a faculty position at Ohio State University. By all accounts, he was living the dream, a kid from a working-class immigrant family who'd become a respected scientist. In the academic world, Hynek was known as meticulous, sceptical, grounded in observable data. He had no patience for speculation or pseudoscience. He believed the universe could be understood through measurement, mathematics, and careful observation. He did not believe in flying saucers. When the UFO phenomenon exploded across America in the late 1940s, after Kenneth Arnold's famous sighting over Mount Rainier in June 1947, after the Roswell incident weeks later, after hundreds of reports began flooding military installations, Hynek thought it was mass hysteria. Post-war anxiety manifesting as delusion. People seeing aircraft and planets and making them into something alien. He said as much in faculty meetings. He wrote dismissive letters to colleagues who took the subject seriously. He considered the whole thing beneath serious scientific inquiry, which is exactly why the Air Force wanted him. 1948. The United States military is hemorrhaging credibility over UFO reports. Pilots, combat veterans with thousands of flight hours, are seeing objects that outperform any known aircraft. Radar operators are tracking things moving at speeds that should tear apart any physical object. The public is fascinated and increasingly convinced the government is hiding something. The Air Force needs someone with impeccable scientific credentials to calm things down. Someone who can look at the data and confidently say, weather balloons, temperature inversions, atmospheric phenomena, misidentified aircraft, optical illusions. Someone who doesn't believe in flying saucers. J. Allen Hynek seemed perfect for the job. He's recruited into Project Sign, the Air Force's first official UFO study, in late 1948. The initial contact comes through official channels, a letter on Air Force letterhead, signed by a general Hynek has never heard of. Would he be interested in consulting on a scientific matter related to aerial phenomena? Compensation provided. Minimal time commitment. Purely advisory role. Hynek is intrigued, and honestly, a little amused. He sees it as an opportunity to apply real science to a question that's become hopelessly muddied by speculation and sensationalism. His job is simple: review sighting reports and provide scientific explanations, and at first that's exactly what he does. A pilot reports seeing a disc-shaped object. Hynek explains it's likely a lenticular cloud formation, which can appear metallic in certain lighting conditions. Radar picks up an unidentified blip. Temperature inversion, he says. Under certain atmospheric conditions, radar waves can bounce off warm air layers, creating false returns. Multiple witnesses see strange lights. Venus, he explains patiently. At certain times of year, Venus appears exceptionally bright and can seem to move due to atmospheric distortion and the observer's own motion. He explains away lights in the sky as Venus, Jupiter, meteors, balloons, experimental aircraft, strange radar blips as temperature anomalies, equipment malfunctions, birds flocking in formation. Pilot reports as optical illusions caused by fatigue, reflected starlight, or misidentified conventional aircraft. Publicly, he tells the press, most UFO sightings can be explained by natural phenomena or misidentification. When you apply rigorous scientific analysis, the mystery disappears. The Air Force loves him. The press quotes him. Skeptics cite him. He becomes known as the scientific voice of reason in a field dominated by speculation. Internally, though, something begins to shift, because some cases don't fit the script. There are reports where Venus can't be the answer because Venus wasn't visible in that part of the sky at that time, where temperature inversions can't explain radar returns, because the atmospheric conditions were documented and stable, where pilot testimony is too detailed, too specific, too consistent with physical evidence on the ground. Hynek starts keeping two sets of notes. The official reports he submits to the Air Force, carefully worded to provide conventional explanations, and his personal observations filed away in notebooks he keeps locked in his office. In those personal notes, a pattern begins to emerge, a growing sense that he's not investigating a phenomenon, he's managing one. Project Grudge and the First Red Flags. By 1951, Project Sign has been quietly restructured into Project Grudge. The name change isn't subtle, and that's the point. Grudge was chosen deliberately. It reflected the Air Force's official stance that UFO reports were a nuisance, a distraction from real national security concerns like the Soviet threat and the Korean War. The mission was no longer investigation, it was dismissal. Hynek noticed the change immediately. The tone of the briefing shifted. The types of cases sent to him changed. Suddenly the most intriguing reports, the ones with multiple witnesses, radar confirmation, physical evidence, weren't reaching his desk anymore. Instead he received obvious misidentifications, hoaxes, reports that were easy to debunk, cases designed to make the entire phenomenon look foolish. When he asked about the more credible cases he'd heard about through military channels, he was told they were being handled by other departments, national security concerns, need-to-know basis. He started keeping more detailed personal notes, fragments that would later surface in his private papers, giving researchers a glimpse into his growing disillusionment. One entry, dated September 1951, received truncated report on Utah sighting. Multiple witnesses, including commercial pilot and ground observers. Witness claimed the object descended vertically at high speed, hovered approximately 200 feet above desert floor for estimated 45 seconds, then accelerated horizontally, disappearing from view in under 3 seconds. Radar confirmation mentioned in initial summary but absent from final reports sent to me. When I requested full radar logs, told they were unavailable due to equipment malfunction. 3 different radar stations experienced simultaneous equipment malfunction. The statistical probability approaches 0. Hynek was starting to see a pattern. The most compelling evidence was being filtered out before it could reach him. He began making inquiries through unofficial channels, conversations with radar technicians at air traffic control centers, informal discussions with pilots he knew from his work at Ohio State. What he heard troubled him deeply. The cases were real. The radar data existed. The photographs were clear. But somewhere between the initial report and official investigation, crucial details were disappearing. And then something stranger happened. Something that convinced Hynek he was under surveillance. He wrote a letter to a colleague at another university, an astronomer named Thomas Gillespie, who he'd known since graduate school. The letter was carefully worded, but it asked a pointed question. Have you noticed institutional resistance to objective UFO study? I'm finding it increasingly difficult to access primary source data. Hynek mailed the letter from the campus post office on a Tuesday morning. He remembered because he had a faculty meeting immediately afterward. The letter never arrived. 2 weeks later, Hynek called Gillespie to follow up. Gillespie said he'd received no letter. Hynek contacted the postal service. They had no record of it being lost or returned. It had been properly stamped, properly addressed. It simply vanished somewhere between the Columbus post office and Berkeley, California. One lost letter might be coincidence. But Hynek had mailed other correspondence that same day. Personal letters to family, a note to a colleague about an upcoming conference. All of those arrived without issue. Just the letter about UFOs disappeared. Hynek wrote in his journal that night, "The phenomenon is not being studied, it is being buried, and I suspect anyone asking too many questions is being watched." That's when he began to suspect he wasn't working for an investigation. He was working for a containment operation, and his role wasn't to find the truth, it was to provide plausible deniability. He considered resigning, but he realized that leaving would mean losing any access he had, however limited. At least inside the program he could see some of the data. He could document the inconsistencies. He could perhaps slowly build a case for the phenomenon's legitimacy. So he stayed. But he stopped trusting his employers, and he started preparing for the possibility that someday someone would need to know what he'd witnessed. Project Blue Book and 22 Years of Controlled Access. 1952. Project Grudge becomes Project Blue Book, a name chosen to sound official, scientific, comprehensive. The rebranding was deliberate. The Air Force needed to convince the public and Congress that they were taking the UFO question seriously. Project Blue Book was given more resources, better staffing, improved investigative protocols. On paper, it looked like a legitimate scientific endeavour. To the public, Blue Book represented the government's good faith effort to understand the UFO phenomenon. It had scientists, standardised reporting forms, investigative teams dispatched to interview witnesses. It published annual reports. It looked legitimate. J. Allen Hynek was appointed Chief Scientific Consultant. His name lent credibility. His presence suggested serious scientific inquiry. For the next 22 years, from 1952 to 1969, he would review thousands of cases. Officially, Blue Book investigated 12,618 UFO reports during its operational lifetime. Hynek later claimed that number was misleading on multiple levels. Many explainable cases, he said, were exaggerated to make the Air Force look thorough. Simple misidentifications, aircraft lights, bright planets, obvious hoaxes, were written up as detailed investigations to pad the statistics. The message: look how many cases we solve. Meanwhile, many genuinely unexplainable cases were either downgraded, reclassified, or removed from the archive entirely before final publication. The process worked like this. A UFO report would come in through military or civilian channels. An initial investigation would be conducted. Witness interviews, site visits, photographic analysis, radar data collection. If the case was easily explainable, it went straight to Blue Book's official files. If the case was complex or unexplainable, it went somewhere else first. Somewhere Hynek didn't have access to. When, or if, he eventually saw it, crucial details had been removed or altered. Witness statements mentioning structured craft were summarised as unusual light in sky. Radar data confirming visual sightings was classified as equipment anomaly. Photographs showing clear objects were deemed inconclusive or possible lens flare. Multiple independent witnesses were reduced to single. Observe a report. Hynek was given edited versions of reality. He began to realise he was seeing a curated version of the phenomenon, the parts someone had decided was safe for him to analyse and publicly explain. He started keeping more extensive personal records. After official investigations, he would quietly contact witnesses directly, conducting informal follow-up interviews. What they told him often contradicted the official reports he'd received. He also began networking with other researchers who were noticing the same patterns. Scientists and military personnel who suspected the official investigation was a facade. The cases that broke him. 2 events changed Hynek from skeptic to believer. Both were real, both remain unexplained, and both revealed just how much the Air Force was willing to manipulate the truth. The Lubbock Lights, August 25, 1951, Lubbock, Texas. 4 college professors are sitting in a backyard enjoying the warm evening air and discussing micrometeorites. These aren't random civilians. They're scientists from Texas Tech. A chemist, a physicist, a petroleum engineer, and a geologist. Professional observers trained to document phenomena accurately. At 9:20 p.m, one of them happens to glance up. What the hell is that? The formation of the lights is moving across the sky. Not random lights. A perfect V-shaped pattern, like birds flying in formation, but faster than any bird could fly. The lights are bright, bluish-white, distinct against the night sky. The formation covers the entire visible sky in about 3 seconds. That's an angular velocity that suggests incredible speed, potentially thousands of miles per hour depending on altitude. The professors barely have time to process what they've seen before it's gone. They sit in stunned silence for a moment, then immediately begin comparing observations. What colour were the lights? How many? What was the exact pattern? How fast were they moving? Their accounts match perfectly. 20 to 30 lights, bluish-white, V-shaped formation, silent, moving from north to south. Then, 18 minutes later, it happens again. Same formation, same speed, same trajectory. Over the next 2 weeks, the lights appear multiple times. Dozens of Lubbock residents see them. The local newspaper runs stories. The sightings make national news. On August 30th, a Texas Tech freshman named Carl Hart Jr. photographs them. He sets up his camera in his backyard, and when the lights appear, he captures 5 clear photographs. The images show the V formation exactly as witnesses described, multiple lights in perfect geometric arrangement. The photographs are remarkably clear. Hart brings them to the newspaper, which publishes them on the front page. The images go national. Life magazine runs them. They become some of the most famous UFO photographs of the era. The Air Force dispatches investigators. Hynek reviews the case file, and he cannot explain it. He interviews the professors personally. These are credible witnesses, trained observers with nothing to gain from fabricating a story. Their descriptions are consistent, detailed, and sober. He examines Hart's photographs. They're not hoaxes. Analysis shows no evidence of double exposure or manipulation. The lights are real. Physical objects photographed over multiple frames. He considers conventional explanations. Aircraft? No aircraft flies in that type of formation or at that speed. Meteors? Meteors don't move in perfect geometric patterns or repeat the same trajectory multiple times over 2 weeks. Reflections? Reflections don't appear to multiple witnesses in different locations and don't move consistently across the sky. Hynek writes in his official analysis, "The lights exhibited intelligent control. They moved in coordinated formations at speeds inconsistent with known aircraft. The photographic evidence is compelling. Multiple credible witnesses with consistent testimony. I cannot provide a conventional explanation that adequately accounts for all observed phenomena." That report goes up the chain of command. When the official Blue Book conclusion is published, the Lubbock lights are attributed to birds reflecting streetlights. Birds? Hynek is furious. He knows this explanation is absurd. Birds don't fly in perfect V formations at supersonic speeds. Birds don't glow with bluish-white luminescence. Birds don't maintain geometric precision while covering the entire visible sky in 3 seconds. But the case is closed. The Air Force has its explanation, and the press runs with it. The Lubbock lights become a joke. Scientists fooled by birds. Hynek tries to push back. He submits a revised report, arguing that the bird explanation doesn't match the data. His report is rejected. He's told the case is resolved and further analysis is unnecessary. That's when Hynek begins to understand his real role. He's not there to investigate. He's there to provide scientific cover for predetermined conclusions. In his private notes he writes, "They don't want truth. They want closure. My job is to make the impossible sound ordinary, regardless of evidence." The Lubbock Lights case stays with him for the rest of his life. In later years, after he'd left Blue Book, he would publicly state that the case remained unexplained and that the official explanation was inadequate. But by then, the damage was done. The public believed the case was solved. The Lonnie Zamora incident. If the Lubbock lights troubled Hynek, the Lonnie Zamora incident shattered his remaining skepticism. April 24th, 1964. Socorro, New Mexico. Late afternoon, just before sunset. Police Sergeant Lonnie Zamora is pursuing a speeding car south of town when he hears a loud roar and sees flames in the distance. His first thought is that the dynamite shack on the edge of town has exploded. He abandons the traffic stop and drives toward the site. The terrain is rough, rocky arroyos and scrub brush. Zamora follows a dirt road up a small hill, struggling to keep his patrol car under control on the loose gravel. He reaches the top of the hill and looks down into the arroyo below. What he sees makes no sense. There's an object resting on the ground. It's oval-shaped, white, smooth, about the size of a car, but the proportions are wrong, wider than it is tall. It's resting on metallic legs, 4 of them, arranged like landing struts. Beside the object stand 2 figures. They're small, as Zamora later estimates around 4 feet tall. They're wearing what look like white coveralls or jumpsuits, one-piece garments, no visible seams. Their proportions seem slightly off in ways Zamora can't quite articulate. The head-to-body ratio isn't quite right. Their movements are too quick, too smooth. Zamora is about 150 yards away. He can't see their faces clearly, but he can see them moving around the object, apparently working on something. Then one of them notices him. The figures react immediately. They move quickly, not running exactly, but moving with a strange fluidity, back toward the object. One disappears around the far side. The other seems to climb or step into an opening Zamora can't quite see. Seconds later, the roar returns, deafening. Zamora describes it as similar to jet engines, but deeper, more resonant. The object begins to glow at the bottom, a bluish-orange flame that doesn't look like combustion. Zamora panics. He thinks it's going to explode. He runs back toward his patrol car, stumbling in the rocks, certain he's about to be incinerated. The roar reaches a crescendo. When Zamora risks a look back, the object is airborne. It hovers briefly, maybe 20 feet off the ground, then begins moving. Not with the acceleration curve of normal aircraft. It goes from hovering to high-speed flight almost instantaneously, moving low across the desert terrain, following the contours of the land. Within seconds, it's gone. Complete silence returns. The entire encounter lasted less than 2 minutes. Zamora immediately radios the sheriff's office. "You're not going to believe what I just saw." Sergeant Sam Chavez arrives within minutes. Together, they go back to the site. The evidence is undeniable. 4 distinct depressions in the hard-packed earth where the landing legs rested. The soil is compressed and shows clear patterns consistent with something heavy bearing down. Burn marks on the desert scrub. Several bushes are charred, still smouldering slightly. The burn patterns are strange, focused in specific areas but not spreading the way a normal fire would. The ground where the object had been is disturbed, smooth in a way that doesn't match the surrounding terrain. Chavez radios for backup. More officers arrive. An FBI agent arrives. The Air Force is notified. Within 24 hours, Project Blue Book dispatches an investigator. Within 48 hours, J. Allen Hynek himself arrives in Socorro. Hynek interviews Zamora extensively. He examines the physical evidence. He talks to other officers who responded. He documents everything meticulously, and he believes Zamora completely. Zamora is a respected officer with 12 years of service. No history of exaggeration, mental instability, or attention-seeking behaviour. He's known in the community as reliable, level-headed, professional. He has nothing to gain from fabricating this story. In fact, he's embarrassed by the attention. He doesn't like talking about it. He's worried it will affect his career. The physical evidence matches his account perfectly. The landing impressions are real. The burn marks are real. The timeline is documented. His radio communications provide a precise record of when he called in the sighting and when other officers arrived. Hynek spends 2 days in Socorro. He walks the site repeatedly. He measures the landing impressions, he interviews witnesses who saw the object from a distance. He checks astronomical data to rule out any conventional explanation. There is no conventional explanation. This wasn't a balloon. It wasn't a helicopter. It was an experimental military craft. The Air Force checked with White Sands Missile Range and Holloman Air Force Base. Nothing was flying in that area at that time. Hynek writes a classified memo to Blue Book headquarters. "This case bothers me deeply. The witness is credible. The evidence is physical and documented. The object described exhibits characteristics beyond any known technology. This may be the most significant case we've encountered. It may be the Roswell of my time." That memo is classified and filed separately from the main Blue Book archive. It never appears in the official reports. Publicly, the case is listed as unidentified, one of the few cases Blue Book couldn't explain away, but the official stance is carefully neutral. We don't know what it was, but there's no evidence it was extraterrestrial. Hynek knows the truth is more complicated. He knows what Zamora saw was real. He knows the object displayed intelligent control and technology far beyond human capability. But he also knows he can't say that publicly without destroying his credibility and his access to future cases. So he does what he's been doing for 16 years. He speaks carefully, hints at the truth, and waits for the day when he might be able to tell the full story. That day never quite comes. The Lonnie Zamora incident remains one of the most credible and well-documented UFO cases in history. Even hardcore skeptics struggle to dismiss it. The witness is too reliable, the evidence too physical, the investigation too thorough. But it also becomes a turning point for Hynek. After Socorro, he can no longer pretend he's dealing with misidentifications and psychological phenomena. Something real is happening, something that doesn't fit into our understanding of reality. And the people running Project Blue Book know it, which is why they're working so hard to keep cases like this from reaching the public eye. The Unseen Files. Years after Blue Book closed, Air Force Colonel Robert Friend, who served as director of Project Blue Book from 1958 to 1963, began speaking more openly about what the program really was. In a 1998 interview, he confirmed what Hynek had long suspected. Blue Book operated two filing systems. One was public, the reports shared with Congress, the media, civilian researchers, and consultants like Hynek. This archive was carefully curated to present UFO reports as primarily explainable, or at least manageable. The other was classified, a parallel archive containing cases the Air Force considered genuinely sensitive. These cases involved military pilots reporting structured craft during active combat or training missions, radar installations at sensitive facilities tracking objects that couldn't be explained as atmospheric phenomena, incidents near nuclear weapons installations, missile silos and strategic air bases, events where physical evidence was collected, material samples, radiation readings, photographic evidence that suggested advanced technology, cases involving multiple military witnesses whose testimony couldn't be easily dismissed. Friend stated in the interview, "There were reports Hynek never saw. Cases that involved national security implications were handled separately. They went to different departments, different channels. Blue Book was the public face. But the serious cases, the ones that really concerned us, those went elsewhere." When the interviewer asked where those cases went, Friend said he didn't know. That information was above his clearance level. Think about that for a moment. The director of Project Blue Book, the military's official UFO investigation program, didn't have access to the most important cases. This explained so much of what Hynek had experienced. It explained why he often felt like he was investigating half stories. Because he was. It explained why witnesses would sometimes tell him details that weren't in the official reports he'd received. Because the reports had been edited before reaching him. It explained why he could never quite build a comprehensive picture of the phenomenon. Because the most compelling pieces of the puzzle were systematically removed from his view. Hynek was a prop, a scientific facade to give Blue Book credibility, while the real investigations happened in compartmented programs he'd never even hear about. He suspected this during his years with Blue Book, but confirmation wouldn't come until after his death, when researchers began interviewing former military personnel willing to speak more openly. By then, it was too late for Hynek to say, "I told you so." The switch from debunker to believer. By the mid-1960s, Hynek could no longer reconcile what he was being told to say with what he knew to be true. Internally, he was keeping extensive notes documenting the disconnect between evidence and official conclusions. He was quietly networking with other scientists who took the phenomenon seriously. He was beginning to speak more carefully at academic conferences, hinting at the limitations of Blue Book's methodology. But he was still publicly defending the program, still explaining away cases, still playing his assigned role. The breaking point came in March 1966, during what became known as the Michigan UFO wave. Between March 14th and March 21st, dozens of people across southeastern Michigan reported seeing strange lights maneuvering over fields, forests, and residential areas. The witnesses included police officers, college students, local officials, housewives, farmers, a complete cross-section of the community. The descriptions were remarkably consistent. Witnesses reported seeing glowing objects that moved erratically, changed colour, hovered in place, then accelerated to high speeds. Some described the objects as disc-shaped. Others saw only the lights. On the night of March 20th, more than 50 people, including 12 police officers, witnessed objects maneuvering over a swampy area near Dexter, Michigan. The objects were seen for several hours. Multiple independent witnesses described the same phenomena. The sightings made national news. Michigan was in an uproar. Congressman Gerald Ford, who represented the area and would later become president, demanded a congressional hearing. The Air Force was under enormous pressure to provide answers. They dispatched Hynek to Michigan to investigate and, more importantly, to make the story go away. Hynek arrived in Ann Arbor on March 23rd. He spent 3 days interviewing witnesses, examining the sites, reviewing reports. The evidence troubled him. These weren't obvious misidentifications. The witnesses were credible. Their accounts were detailed and consistent. The duration of the sightings, hours in some cases, ruled out meteors or aircraft. But the Air Force needed an explanation. Now. The press was calling, Congress was watching, the public was demanding answers. On March 25th, Hynek held a press conference. Standing before a room packed with journalists and television cameras, under pressure from his Air Force handlers, he offered an explanation. Swamp gas. He explained that decaying vegetation in marshland can produce marsh gas, primarily methane, which can spontaneously ignite under certain conditions, creating glowing lights that appear to move. The reaction was immediate and brutal. The press erupted in laughter. Reporters shouted questions. "Are you serious? Swamp gas? That's your explanation?" The witnesses felt betrayed. The police officers who'd risked their credibility by reporting what they saw were humiliated. The scientific community was embarrassed for him. Swamp gas creating lights that multiple trained observers watched for hours, moving in coordinated patterns. It was absurd. Within hours, editorial cartoons were mocking him. Headlines declared Air Force blames UFOs on swamp gas. Late-night comedians made jokes. Hynek became a punchline, a government scientist willing to blame anything, no matter how ridiculous, rather than admit the obvious. But what the public didn't know, what wasn't revealed until years later when Hynek's personal papers were examined, was that he had written a very different report before the press conference. In his internal analysis, submitted to Project Blue Book headquarters 3 days before going public, he'd stated, "The objects described by witnesses exhibited controlled, intelligent movement inconsistent with natural phenomena. They maneuvered with flight characteristics beyond human capability, instant acceleration, stationary hovering, coordinated group behavior." Multiple independent witnesses, including trained observers, provide consistent testimony. Physical evidence includes electromagnetic interference with vehicle ignition systems and compass anomalies. Swamp gas does not adequately explain the observed phenomena. This case deserves serious scientific study, not dismissal. That report was rewritten before release. Hynek was told to stick to the swamp gas explanation or resign from Blue Book. He could have resigned. He could have held the press conference and said, "I don't know what these people saw, but it wasn't swamp gas." He could have maintained his scientific integrity, but he stayed. He gave the explanation they demanded. He became the man who blamed UFOs on swamp gas. Why? In private correspondence years later, Hynek tried to explain his reasoning. He still believed he could do more good inside the system than outside it. He thought that by maintaining his position, he could continue documenting cases, building evidence, preparing for a time when the truth might emerge. He also feared what would happen if he spoke out, not just to his career, but to the phenomenon itself. He worried that if he, the chief scientific consultant to Blue Book, publicly stated that UFOs were real and represented unknown technology, the backlash would set serious research back decades. So he swallowed his pride, accepted the humiliation, and continued playing his role. But something inside him broke that day in Michigan. From that point forward, Hynek began quietly reaching out to other scientists who took the phenomenon seriously. He started building a network outside official channels. He began planning for a time when he would no longer be constrained by Air Force protocols. He also began speaking more carefully but more pointedly at academic conferences and in scholarly papers. He never explicitly contradicted Blue Book's conclusions, but he raised methodological concerns. He questioned whether the investigation was designed to find truth or provide reassurance. Those who understood what he was doing, other researchers, sympathetic colleagues, recognized that Hynek was laying groundwork, building a case, preparing to speak more openly when the time was right. Hynek contacts other scientists. In the late 1960s, as Project Blue Book began its slow decline toward closure, Hynek intensified his outreach to researchers outside the military system. He established correspondence with Jacques Vallée, a French-American computer scientist who was taking a more rigorous data-driven approach to UFO research. Vallée wasn't interested in sensationalism or speculation. He wanted patterns, statistical analysis, cross-cultural comparison. Hynek and Vallée exchanged hundreds of letters over the years. In those letters, carefully worded to avoid revealing classified information, Hynek hinted at the frustrations of working within Blue Book. In a 1967 letter, Hynek wrote, "There are cases the Air Force will not let me classify as unexplained, though they clearly are. I receive reports that have been sanitized, edited, stripped of their most compelling details. It's like trying to study a phenomenon through a filter designed to make it invisible." Vallée later claimed that Hynek believed a hidden intelligence unit was operating within the Air Force, a group tasked with managing UFO incidents in ways that bypassed Blue Book entirely. This wasn't paranoia. Hynek had seen evidence of parallel investigations, cases referenced in internal memos that never appeared in official files, witnesses who mentioned talking to other Air Force investigators, who Hynek never met. Hynek also communicated with James McDonald, an atmospheric physicist from the University of Arizona, who became one of the most vocal scientific critics of Project Blue Book. McDonald was everything Hynek couldn't be: bold, confrontational, willing to publicly challenge the Air Force's conclusions. He testified before Congress, accusing Blue Book of incompetence and deliberate obfuscation. He published papers arguing that UFOs represented a genuine scientific mystery deserving serious study. The Air Force hated McDonald. They viewed him as a threat. They worked behind the scenes to undermine his credibility, questioning his professional judgment, suggesting his UFO research was affecting his scientific work. Hynek admired McDonald's courage, but couldn't publicly align with him. Doing so would have ended his access to Blue Book and eliminated any influence he had on official investigations. Instead, Hynek supported McDonald privately. He shared data. He confirmed inconsistencies in official reports. He validated McDonald's criticisms while maintaining public neutrality. It was a delicate balance, staying inside the system while supporting those trying to expose its failures. Hynek also exchanged letters with Alan Sandage, one of the world's leading astronomers and Hynek's former colleague from Ohio State. Sandage was skeptical of UFOs but respected Hynek's integrity. In one letter, dated June 1968, Hynek wrote something remarkably candid. "Alan, I no longer believe we are dealing with misidentifications or psychological phenomena. After 20 years of reviewing these cases, I'm convinced something real is interacting with us. The question is not whether the phenomenon exists. It does. The question is, what is it, and why is the government so determined to prevent serious scientific study?" Sandage's response was cautious but supportive. He encouraged Hynek to document everything, to prepare for a time when he could speak more freely. He also warned Hynek to be careful, to avoid saying anything that might give his critics ammunition to destroy his reputation. Through these relationships, Hynek began building what would eventually become a post-Blue Book research network. He was preparing for the day when the official investigation ended and the real work could begin. Blue Book closes, but the questions remain. December 17, 1969. The Air Force officially shuts down Project Blue Book. The decision is based on the Condon Report, a study conducted by the University of Colorado and led by physicist Edward Condon. After 2 years of investigation, Condon concludes, "No evidence that UFOs represent extraterrestrial craft. No evidence that UFOs pose a threat to national security. No scientific value in continued study. The report recommends terminating Blue Book and discontinuing official UFO investigations." The Air Force is thrilled. They've wanted to exit the UFO business for years. The program is a public relations nightmare, a budget drain, a constant source of congressional questions. With Condon's academic blessing, they can finally shut it down. At a press conference, Air Force officials announced Blue Book's closure with barely concealed relief. The official statement is brief. After 22 years of investigation, we have found no evidence that UFOs represent a threat, or that they are vehicles from other worlds. The matter is now considered closed. Hynek attends the press conference. He says nothing. Later, in interviews with mainstream media, he carefully endorses the closure. He tells reporters that most UFO cases can be explained, that the public's fears are unwarranted. The Air Force made a good faith effort to study the phenomenon. He plays his role one last time. But privately, to fellow researchers and in letters to trusted colleagues, Hynek says something very different. Blue Book was the storefront. The real research continued elsewhere. He explains his theory. The Air Force never stopped investigating UFOs. They simply stopped doing it publicly. The cases that really mattered, the ones involving military encounters, radar confirmations, physical evidence, were never part of Blue Book anyway. They were handled through compartmented programs with higher classification levels. Shutting down Blue Book wasn't about ending UFO research. It was about ending public scrutiny. Think about the logic. If UFOs were genuinely unimportant, why investigate them at all? But if they were genuinely important, if they represented unknown technology or potential threats, would you really conduct that investigation in a public program that published annual reports and answered congressional inquiries? Of course not. You'd create a public program that appeared to investigate while the real work happened in the shadows. Hynek believed Blue Book was always meant to fail. Its purpose was to absorb public attention and criticism while protecting the actual investigations from exposure. After Blue Book closed, Hynek was finally free to speak more openly. In 1973, he founded the Center for UFO Studies, creating an independent civilian database of sightings. He began giving lectures at universities, speaking more candidly about Blue Book's limitations and the cases that troubled him. He published a book, The UFO Experience, in which he developed a classification system for UFO encounters and argued that the phenomenon deserved serious scientific study. He was no longer the government's debunker. He was the phenomenon's most credible advocate, and he was convinced, absolutely convinced, that the truth was far stranger and more complex than anyone publicly acknowledged. The Missing Hynek Files. When J. Allen Hynek died on April 27, 1986, researchers and archivists at the Center for UFO Studies immediately began the process of cataloguing his personal papers. They expected a treasure trove of documentation. Hynek had been meticulous about record-keeping throughout his career. They knew he maintained extensive personal files separate from his official work. Notes, correspondence, case analyses, witness interviews, classified memos he'd managed to copy before returning them. The archive would be invaluable. Decades of first-hand observations from the man who'd been inside Project Blue Book for 22 years. Evidence of the cases they'd never published. Proof of the filtering and manipulation he'd witnessed. What they found was incomplete. Several critical categories of material were missing entirely. His personal notes on the Lonnie Zamora case, gone. These weren't official Blue Book files. These were Hynek's private observations, his interviews with Zamora conducted years after the incident, his analysis of why the case remained unexplainable. He'd referenced these notes in correspondence as recently as 1985. His private Blue Book diary, gone. Hynek had kept a personal journal throughout the 1960s, documenting his daily experiences inside Blue Book. Not the sanitized official reports, but his real thoughts, his frustrations, his observations about how cases were manipulated. He'd shown portions of this diary to close colleagues. It was several hundred pages long, an entire folder labelled 1965 Northeast Radar Incidents. Gone. This folder contained documentation of multiple radar trackings of unknown objects over the northeastern United States during a concentrated period in 1965. These cases never made it into Blue Book's official reports. Hynek had been collecting data independently, building a case that the phenomenon was real and being deliberately ignored. His correspondence with Air Force intelligence officers between 1958 and 1964 gone. Hynek had maintained relationships with several intelligence officers who'd worked adjacent to Blue Book. Some of them had provided him with information about cases handled outside official channels. Their letters were candid, sometimes shockingly so, about the reality of what was happening. A box of witness interviews on audio cassette, gone. In the 1970s and early 80s, Hynek had revisited some of the most significant Blue Book cases, conducting new interviews with witnesses now willing to speak more freely. These recordings contained details that had never been made public. Hynek's family was adamant. The files had been in his office shortly before his death. His wife remembered seeing them when she'd helped him organise his study 3 weeks before he died. His son remembered his father mentioning the Lonnie Zamora notes, specifically in a conversation just days before the heart attack. But within a week of Hynek's death, between the funeral and when the archivists arrived to begin cataloguing, the files disappeared. The family filed inquiries. They contacted the Centre for UFO Studies. They reached out to former colleagues, asking if Hynek had loaned materials to anyone. No one had taken the files, or if they had, they weren't admitting it. Mark Roediger, who became the scientific director of the Centre for UFO Studies, later said, "It felt like someone had surgically removed the most sensitive material. Not everything, just the pieces that would have been most damaging if made public. Whoever took them knew exactly what they were looking for." The official explanation was that Hynek had likely misplaced or destroyed the documents himself in his final years. Perhaps his health had been declining. Perhaps he'd been disorganized. But people who knew Hynek found that impossible to believe. Even in his 70s, he remained sharp, organized, obsessive about documentation. He'd spent 30 years building his archive. He'd talked about it as his legacy, the evidence he'd accumulated for future researchers. Why would he destroy it? And if he'd merely misplaced it, why specifically those files? Why not a random scattering of material? Why precisely the documents that contained the most sensitive information? The alternative explanation, that someone removed the files deliberately, raised darker questions. Who had access to Hynek's home in the days after his death? Who knew what was in his archive and which pieces were most damaging? Who had the motivation to ensure those specific documents never became public? Those questions remain unanswered, but the disappearance of the files became part of Hynek's story. One more suggestion that his suspicions about surveillance and suppression weren't paranoia. The hypothesis Hynek never published in the fragments that remained of Hynek's personal archive, researchers found hints of a theory he'd been developing in his final years, a hypothesis that went far beyond simple aliens from another planet. Based on his notes, private correspondence and conversations recalled by close colleagues, Hynek believed the UFO phenomenon was non-human in origin. Not human technology, not misidentification, not psychological phenomena. Something genuinely other. Technologically superior to anything humans had developed. The flight characteristics alone, instant acceleration, right-angle turns at high speeds, apparent disregard for inertia, suggested technology centuries or millennia ahead of us, intentionally masking itself. The phenomenon appeared in ways that made it difficult to study or prove. It avoided clear, unambiguous encounters. It left just enough evidence to suggest something real, while providing skeptics with plausible deniability, as if it wanted to be seen but not confirmed. Possibly interdimensional rather than extraterrestrial. This was Hynek's most radical conclusion. He'd grown skeptical of the simple, visitors from another planet explanation. The objects didn't behave like scouts or explorers. They didn't follow patterns consistent with scientific observation or resource gathering. They appeared and disappeared in ways that seemed to violate physics, not because they broke physical laws, but because they were using those laws in ways we didn't yet comprehend. In a letter to Jacques Vallée dated November 1983, Hynek wrote, "I increasingly suspect we're dealing with something that exists in a relationship to our reality, that we don't have the conceptual framework to understand. These objects don't travel through space in the conventional sense. They don't seem to come from anywhere and go anywhere. They manifest, they appear, and then they're gone, as if our three-dimensional space is just one layer of a more complex structure. He elaborated on this in a 1985 paper presented to a small group of physicists and theorists. Physical laws are not violated. They are used in ways we do not yet grasp. What appears impossible, instantaneous acceleration, dematerialization, apparent defiance of gravity, may simply reflect our incomplete understanding of physics. Just as quantum mechanics revealed layers of reality invisible to classical physics, perhaps the UFO phenomenon operates in dimensions or states of being we haven't yet discovered. This was radical thinking. It suggested the phenomenon wasn't just advanced technology. It was something far more complex, possibly involving dimensions or realities beyond our current scientific framework. It also explained some of the pattern Hynek had observed over 3 decades. Why the phenomenon never provided clear, unambiguous proof of its existence. Why it seemed to adapt to human perception, appearing in ways that fit cultural expectations. Airships in the 1890s, rockets in the 1940s, sleek saucers in the 50s. Why witness accounts were often surreal, dreamlike, filled with absurd details that made them easy to dismiss, as if the phenomenon was operating in a space where the normal rules of physical reality were more fluid. Why scientific study seemed to make it recede, as if observation itself affected the phenomenon. Hynek never published this hypothesis. He discussed it only with close colleagues, and even then carefully. He knew how it would sound. He knew it would destroy whatever mainstream credibility he had left. The scientific community barely tolerated his advocacy for UFO research as potential extraterrestrial visitation. If he started talking about interdimensional phenomena and reality structures beyond our understanding, he'd be dismissed as a crank. So he kept it private, sharing only with those he trusted to understand the distinction between speculative theory and ungrounded fantasy. But in his final years, he became increasingly convinced this was the right direction. The phenomenon was real, but it was stranger than simple aliens from another planet. It was something that challenged our fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality itself. Hynek's final warning. In the weeks before his death, Hynek gave a series of informal talks to small groups of researchers, private gatherings, not publicized, attended by people who had been following the phenomenon for decades. One attendee, a physicist who'd known Hynek since the 1970s, later recounted a conversation that took place at a Chicago restaurant in March 1986, just weeks before Hynek's death. Hynek was reflective that night, almost melancholy. He talked about his years with Blue Book, the cases that still troubled him, the pattern of suppression he'd witnessed. Then he said something the physicists would never forget. The Air Force knew the truth far earlier than they will admit. I'm certain of it now. They had cases in the late 40s and early 50s that were absolutely clear. Multiple witnesses, radar confirmation, physical evidence, cases that couldn't be explained away, and they made a decision. The truth was too destabilizing to reveal. The physicist asked what he meant by destabilizing. Hynek explained, "If you tell people that non-human intelligence is interacting with us, that our understanding of reality is fundamentally incomplete, that the government has been lying for decades, what happens? Religious institutions face challenges to their cosmology. Scientific paradigms crumble. Public trust in government evaporates. Social stability depends on shared assumptions about reality. Pull one thread, and the entire fabric might unravel. They chose containment over disclosure." "Do you think that was the right choice?" someone asked. Hynek was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I don't know. Maybe they genuinely believed they were protecting people from information they weren't ready to handle. Maybe they were right to be cautious, but I think they underestimated humanity. I think people are more resilient than the gatekeepers give them credit for. And I think the cost of secrecy, the cost of allowing this phenomenon to remain unexamined by the full scope of human science, that cost might be higher than the risk of disclosure. Another researcher asked if Hynek thought disclosure would ever happen. "I used to think it would come gradually," Hynek replied. "Slow revelation, careful management, but I'm not sure anymore. The secrecy has gone on so long, the compartmentalization runs so deep, I'm not sure the people currently in charge even know the full picture. The information is scattered across agencies that don't communicate. The institutional memory is fragmented. We might have reached a point where the truth can't be disclosed because no one person or organisation has access to all of it." This was a chilling idea, that the cover-up had become so complex, so bureaucratically distributed, that it had transcended any individual or agency's control. The secrecy had become self-perpetuating, maintaining itself through sheer organisational inertia. Before they left the restaurant that night, Hynek said one more thing. "I've documented what I could. I've left a record. Maybe someday, when the time is right, someone will be able to piece together the full picture. All I can do is leave breadcrumbs and hope someone follows them." 5 weeks later, he was dead. Operation Sentinel. One of the most intriguing and unverified claims about Hynek's final years involves a program allegedly called Operation Sentinel. According to Jerome Davis, a researcher who claims to have spoken with Hynek at a conference in September 1985, Hynek mentioned a classified monitoring program that allegedly continued UFO surveillance after Blue Book ended. Davis's account, published years later in a UFO research journal, describes a conversation where Hynek seemed unusually candid, perhaps because he was among colleagues, perhaps because he was growing weary of maintaining secrecy. Hynek allegedly said, "Blue Book ended, but the work didn't. There's a program, I don't know what it's officially called, but I've heard it referred to as Sentinel. It's joint CIA and Air Force, with cooperation from NASA and possibly other agencies. It uses advanced surveillance technology that didn't exist when Blue Book was operating." He described what Sentinel allegedly involved: reconnaissance satellites specifically tasked with tracking objects entering and leaving Earth's atmosphere. Not the general surveillance satellites everyone knows about, but specialized systems designed to detect unconventional propulsion signatures and anomalous trajectories. Radar triangulation networks across the continental United States, positioned to provide overlapping coverage and immediate notification when objects moving at unconventional speeds or exhibiting unusual flight characteristics are detected. International reporting systems coordinated with allied nations, Britain, Canada, Australia, potentially others. A data-sharing network that allows for tracking of objects across national boundaries. Automated analysis systems using computer algorithms to filter reports and identify patterns, something that wasn't technologically feasible during Blue Book's operation, but became possible in the 70s and 80s. According to Davis, Hynek claimed he'd heard about Sentinel from a former intelligence officer who'd reached out to him in the late 1970s. The officer was dying of cancer and wanted to unburden himself before the end. They met at a hotel near O'Hare Airport. The meeting lasted less than an hour. The officer, Hynek never revealed his name, described an operation that had been running since the early 70s, shortly after Blue Book's closure. Blue Book was a public relations operation, the officer allegedly told Hynek. Sentinel was the real program. We kept tracking, we kept analysing, we kept investigating. We just stopped telling anyone about it. When Hynek asked why the secrecy was maintained, the officer supposedly replied, "Because the phenomenon never stopped. The sightings continued. The radar trackings continued, and we still don't understand what we're dealing with." But admitting that publicly, after spending 20 years telling everyone there's nothing to worry about, that would be career suicide for everyone involved. There is no official record of Operation Sentinel. No documents have surfaced. No whistleblower has provided corroborating testimony. No budget lines in declassified Air Force spending show a program by that name. But the idea fits perfectly with the pattern Hynek had observed for decades, a public facade covering a secret reality. If Sentinel existed, it would explain several things. Why the Air Force was so comfortable shutting down Blue Book. They didn't need public legitimacy anymore. They could monitor the phenomenon privately, without congressional oversight or media scrutiny. Why credible sighting reports continued to come from military pilots and radar installations after 1969, but no official investigation was conducted. The investigation was happening, just not publicly. Why Hynek remained convinced that the government knew more than it was revealing? Because they did. The investigation never stopped. Some researchers dismiss the Sentinel story as unverifiable rumour. Others point out that the absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, especially when dealing with classified programs. What's notable is that Hynek, a cautious, methodical scientist, found the story credible enough to mention it to colleagues. He wasn't prone to repeating unverified claims. If he talked about Sentinel, he believed there was something to it. Whether that program existed under that name or something like it existed under a different designation, the central claim seems almost certainly true. The United States government didn't stop investigating UFOs when Blue Book closed. They just stopped doing it in public view. Hynek's legacy. The man who tried to tell us softly. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Hynek began slipping information into public speeches and academic presentations. He'd give a talk about the history of Project Blue Book and then casually mention, there were cases involving objects tracked on radar that Blue Book never officially logged. The data exists, but it was classified at the time and remains so today. Or he'd discuss the methodology of UFO investigation and note, cases involving multiple military witnesses and physical evidence often bypassed Blue Book entirely. They were handled through different channels. I wasn't given access to them. Or he'd talk about the Lonnie Zamora incident and add, I wrote extensive analysis concluding this was a genuine unknown. That analysis was classified. The public version of my conclusions was simplified. He never made explicit accusations. He never named specific agencies or individuals. He never violated his security clearances or revealed classified information. But for those paying attention, researchers who understood the implications, the message was clear. The official story was incomplete. The truth was far more complex and far more troubling. Hynek was leaving a trail, building a case, providing future researchers with hints about where to look and what questions to ask. He also began mentoring younger researchers, passing on his knowledge and connections. He made sure that when he died, there would be people who understood what he'd learned and could continue asking questions. After his death, archivists at the Center for UFO Studies discovered how extensive his network had become. He'd been corresponding with scientists, journalists, military personnel, and intelligence community members across the country and around the world. Many of these correspondents came forward after his death, sharing letters and notes Hynek had sent them. The picture that emerged was of a man conducting a careful, decades-long campaign to preserve evidence and build support for serious scientific study, all while navigating the constraints of his security clearances and professional reputation. One archivist at QFOS said there were files he could never show publicly, and they vanished the same week he died. But he'd been preparing for that possibility. He'd shared information with enough people, in enough different places, that the core of what he knew survived even if the physical documents didn't. The question was whether anyone would be able to piece together the fragments he'd left behind. The real story is in the cases they never let him touch. Researchers estimate that approximately 20% of Project Blue Book's data was never made public. This isn't speculation. It's based on comparisons between the number of cases Blue Book officially investigated, 12,618, references in internal military documents to cases that don't appear in Blue Book's published reports, testimony from military personnel who filed UFO reports that never showed up in the official archive, analysis of Blue Book's case numbering system, which shows gaps suggesting removed cases. These were the cases involving military pilots reporting structured craft with no visible propulsion during active flight operations, not training exercises where misidentification might be understandable, but combat-ready pilots on routine patrol who encountered objects that outmaneuvered their aircraft. radar operators tracking objects accelerating from stationary hover to thousands of miles per hour in seconds. Not atmospheric anomalies or equipment glitches, but solid returns tracked across multiple systems, sometimes visually confirmed by pilots. Incidents near nuclear installations, missile silos and strategic air bases, sightings that occurred over the most sensitive military facilities, suggesting intelligence rather than random encounters. Events with physical evidence, scorched earth, radiation readings above background levels, electromagnetic interference with vehicle ignition and electronic systems, material samples that couldn't be identified, cases involving multiple categories of evidence simultaneously, visual sighting plus radar confirmation, plus physical effects, plus multiple witnesses. The cases where everything lined up and no conventional explanation fit. Hynek was systematically excluded from these cases. When he asked about them, he was told they involved national security. When he pressed for access, he was told the evidence was inconclusive or that the witnesses were unreliable. This despite some witnesses being highly trained military personnel with impeccable service records. He knew the pattern. The best evidence was always classified, always buried, always kept just out of reach. In his final interview with Rebecca Marks, Hynek said, "The real story is in the cases they never let me touch. That data still exists somewhere, locked in archives, hidden in compartmented programs, scattered across intelligence agencies that don't communicate with each other. Maybe it's in an Air Force vault at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, where Project Blue Book was headquartered. Maybe it's in CIA archives, filed under counterintelligence rather than aerial phenomena. Maybe it's in the National Reconnaissance Office, mixed in with satellite surveillance data. Maybe it's distributed across multiple agencies, each holding pieces of a puzzle none of them can see completely. And maybe, just maybe, there are people inside those agencies who know the full truth. People who've seen the evidence Hynek never could. People who understand what's been interacting with us for decades. People who carry the same burden Hynek carried, knowing something that changes everything but being unable to speak. The question is, will they ever tell us? Or will the phenomenon remain what it's always been? Something we glimpse, something we document, something we can never quite prove. A reality that exists in the gap between what we can observe and what we can conclusively demonstrate. J. Allen Hynek spent 30 years trying to answer that question. He started as a debunker and ended as a believer. He worked for the government and was betrayed by it. He maintained his scientific reputation while quietly building a case for the phenomenon's reality. He wanted to tell the truth but was trapped by classification, career pressures, and the knowledge that some truths destroy the people who speak them too directly. In the end, he did what he could. He left clues. He built networks. He spoke carefully but persistently. He documented everything he could, knowing that someday someone might be able to piece together what he'd learned. And then he died. 3 months after giving an interview that someone thought was dangerous enough to erase. The tape is gone. But the questions remain. What did Hynek really know? What was in those missing files? Who decided the public couldn't handle the truth? And most importantly, is the phenomenon still active? Are unknown objects still being tracked, investigated, documented in classified programs we'll never hear about? Maybe someday we'll find out. Maybe the truth will emerge gradually through freedom of information requests and whistleblower testimony. Maybe some future equivalent of Hynek will decide the time has come to speak openly. Consequences be damned. Or maybe, like so many things in this field, we'll be left with fragments, hints, and the growing suspicion that reality is far stranger than we've been allowed to believe. One thing is certain. J. Allen Hynek believed the phenomenon was real. After 3 decades of study, after seeing the evidence firsthand, after witnessing the suppression and manipulation, he was convinced. And if someone with his credentials, his experience, his access to classified data came to that conclusion, maybe the rest of us should pay attention. Because if he was right, if the government really has been hiding the truth for 70 years, then we're living in a reality fundamentally different from the one we've been told exists, and that changes everything. This is Sleep Theories, where documented truth is stranger than fiction. Sleep well, and keep asking questions, because somewhere, in a classified vault, in a forgotten archive, in the memory of aging intelligence officers who'll carry secrets to their graves, the truth is waiting. The truth J. Allen Hynek spent his life trying to reveal. The truth about what's been visiting us, watching us, studying us. The truth we're still not allowed to know, but someday maybe we will.